Hello, I am the Reading Rainbow Emperor, and today I'm going to be reading from a favorite book of mine called Phantastes by George MacDonald. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a beautiful book, and it's one of those books that I will keep with me for the rest of my life. Partially because it is a beautiful book for its own sake. A lot of books out there just don't have this quality of prose, this excellent, this timing, this drama, this it's like it's one of those things like you might say, yeah, but it's just a dude wandering the fairy haunted forest. Like what's exciting about that? Well, it's kind of a meditation on masculinity and manhood as much as it is about personal growth and the journey that one must take. Um there's pain and hurt and all these things that are dealt with, but also great themes of continuing on to overcome, to sort of like ignore what your past is to take what's in front of you. Um, and it's not like there's no action or anything in there. It's just a lot of interesting things. It's an eclectic book, from anything from knighthood to horror to heroism to darkness and all this other stuff, but it never loses track of what it is. Everything in it is itself, and everything in it kind of works together. In this case, I'm going to be reading out from the first chapter and introduction of this book. I also, similar to what I did with Awaken the Nightland, but it's going to be more specific, more dedicated to what this is. Yeah, I love this book. I recommend it to everyone. 10 out of 10. 11 out of 10. 11 out of 11. That's how you know I'm serious. One can imagine stories without rational cohesion and yet filled with associations like dreams, and poems that are merely lovely sounding, full of beautiful words, but also without rational sense and connections, with, at the most, individual verses which are intelligible, like fragments of most varied things. This true poesy can at times have a general allegorical meaning and an indirect effect as music does. This is nature, so purely poetic, like the room of a magician or a physicist, like a children's nursery or a carpenter's shop. A fairy story is like a vision without rational connections, a harmonious whole of miraculous things and events, as for example a musical fantasia, the harmonic sequence of an aeolian harp, and indeed nature itself. In a genuine fairy story, everything must be miraculous, mysterious, and interrelated. Everything must be alive, each in its own way. The whole of nature must be wondrously blended with the whole world of the spirit. In a fairy story, the time of anarchy, lawlessness, freedom, and the natural state of nature makes itself felt in the world. The world of the fairy story is that world which is opposed throughout to the world of rational truth, and precisely for that reason it is so thoroughly an analog to it as chaos is an analog to finished creation. And that was by Novalis. Chapter 1. A Spirit. The undulating woods, and silent well, and rippling rivulet, and evening gloom, now deepening the dark shades for speech assuming, held commune with him, as if he and it were all that was. Shelley's Alastor. I awoke one morning with the usual perplexity of mind which accompanies the return of consciousness. As I lay and looked through the eastern window of my room, a faint streak of peach color, dividing a cloud that just rose above the low swell of the horizon, announced the approach of the sun. As my thoughts, which a deep and apparently dreamless sleep had dissolved, began again to assume crystalline forms, the strange events of the foregoing night presented themselves anew to my wondering consciousness. The day before had been my 21st birthday. Among the other ceremonies investing me with my legal rights, the keys of an old secretary, in which my father had kept his private papers, had been delivered up to me. As soon as I was left alone, I ordered the lights in the chamber where the secretary stood, the first lights that had been there for many a year, for, since my father's death, the room had been left undisturbed, but as if the darkness had been too long and inmate to be easily expelled, and had dyed with blackness the walls to which bat-like it had clung. These tapers serve, sorry for that, but Uh, I live in a bad neighborhood. But ill to light up the glooming it had clung. Hold on. I'm going to try and cut this out. I have a free video editor. And had died with black. Hold on. Had been too long an inmate to be easily expelled, and had dyed with blackness the walls, to which bat-like it had clung. These tapers served but ill to light up the gloomy hangings, and seemed to throw yet darker shadows into the hollowness of the deep-wrought cornice. All the further portions of the room lay shrouded in mystery, whose deepest folds were gathered around the dark oak cabinet which I now approached with a strange mingling of reverence and curiosity. Perhaps, like a geologist, I was about to turn up to the light some of the buried strata of the human world, with its fossil remains charred by passion and petrified by tears. Perhaps I was to learn how my father, whose personal history was unknown to me, had woven his web of story, how he had found the world, and how the world had left him. Perhaps I was to find only records of lands and moneys, how gotten and how secured, coming down from strange men, and through troublous times, to me, who knew little or nothing of them all. To solve my speculations, and to dispel the awe which was fast gathering around me, as if the dead were drawing near, I approached the secretary, and having found the key that fitted the upper portion, I opened it with some difficulty, drew near it a heavy high-backed chair, and sat down before the multitude of little drawers and slides and pigeonholes. But the door of the little cupboard in the center especially attracted my interest, as if there lay the secret of the long hidden world. Its key I found. One of the rusty hinges cracked and broke as I opened the door. It revealed a number of small pigeonholes, those, however, being but shallow compared to the depth of those around the little cupboard, the outer ones reaching to the back of the desk. I concluded that there must be some accessible space behind, and found indeed that there were formed in a separate framework which admitted of the whole being pulled out in one piece. Behind I found a flexible portcullis of small bars of wood laid close together horizontally. After a long search and trying many ways to move it, I discovered at last a scarcely projecting point of steel on one side. I pressed this repeatedly and hard with the point of an old tool that was lying near, till at length it yielded up inwards, and the little slide, flying up suddenly, disclosed a chamber, empty, except that in one corner lay a heap of withered rose leaves, whose long-lived scent had long since departed, and in another a small pack of papers, tied with a bit of ribbon, whose color had gone with the rose scent. Almost fearing to touch them, they witness so mutely to the law of oblivion. I leaned back in my chair and regarded them a moment, when suddenly there stood in the threshold of the little chamber, as though she had just emerged from its depth, a tiny woman form, as perfect in shape as if she had been a small Greek statuette roused to life and motion. Her dress was of a kind that could never grow old-fashioned, because it was simply natural, a robe plaited in a band around the neck and confined by a belt around the waist, descended to her feet. It was only afterwards, however, that I took notice of her dress, although my surprise was by no means of so overpowering a degree as such an apparition might naturally be expected to excite. Seeing, however, as I suppose, some astonishment in my countenance, she came forward within a yard of me, and said in a voice that strangely recalled the sensation of twilight and reedy river banks and a low wind, even in this deathly room, "Anodos, you never saw such a little creature before, did you?" "No," said I, "and indeed I hardly believe I do now." "Ah, that is always the way with you men. You believe nothing the first time, and is foolish enough to let mere repetition convince you of what you consider in itself unbelievable. I am not going to argue with you, however, but to grant you a wish." Here I could not help interrupting her with the foolish speech, of which, however, I had no cause to repent. "How can such a very little creature as you grant or refuse anything?" "Is that the philosophy of what you have gained in 1 and 20 years?" said she. "Form is much, but size is nothing. It is merely a matter of relation. I suppose your 6-foot lordship does not feel altogether insignificant, although to others you do look small beside your old Uncle Ralph, who rises above you a great half-foot at least. But size is of so little consequence with me that I may as well accommodate myself to your foolish prejudices." So saying, she leapt from the desk upon the floor, where she stood, a tall and gracious lady, with a pale face and large blue eyes. Her dark hair flowed behind, wavy but uncurled, down to her waist, and against it her form stood clear in its robe of white. "Now," said she, "you will believe me." Overcome with the presence of a beauty which I could not perceive, and drawn towards her by an attraction irresistible as incomprehensible, I suppose I stretched out my arms towards her, for she drew back a step or two, and said, "Foolish boy, if you could touch me, I should hurt you. Besides, I was 237 years old last Midsummer's Eve, and a man must not fall in love with his grandmother, you know." "But you are not my grandmother," said I. "How do you know that?" she retorted. "I dare say you know something of your great-grandfathers a good deal further back than that, but you know very little about your great-grandmothers on either side. Now, to the point. Your little sister was reading a fairy tale to you last night." "She was." When she had finished, she said, as she closed the book, "Is there a fairy country, brother?" You replied with a sigh, "I suppose there is, if one could find the way to it." "I did, but I meant something quite different from what you seem to think." "Never mind what I seem to think. You shall find the way into fairyland tomorrow. Now, look in my eyes." Eagerly I did so. They filled me with an unknown longing. I remembered somehow that my mother died when I was a baby. I looked deeper and deeper till they spread around me like seas, and I sank in their waters. I forgot all the rest till I found myself at the window, whose gloomy curtains were withdrawn, and where I stood gazing on a whole heaven of stars, small and sparkling in the moonlight. Below lay a sea, still as death and hoary in the moon, sweeping into bays and around capes and islands, away, away, I knew not whither. Alas, it was no sea, but a low fog, burnished by the moon. "Surely there is such a sea somewhere," I said to myself. A low, sweet voice beside me replied, "In fairyland, Onodos." I turned, but saw no one. I closed the secretary, and went to my own room and to bed. All this I recalled as I lay with half-closed eyes. I was soon to find the truth of the lady's promise, that this day I should discover the road into fairyland. I'll be reading this chapter by chapter and talking about it briefly after, in a sort of Reading Rainbow book club. Reading Rainbow Emperor book club. There we go. I can't go too close to Reading Rainbow, otherwise they might come after me. But essentially, this is a great book. I don't know if how much you paid attention to my language or diction, but the phrases in here are lyrical, almost music to itself, almost a poetry to itself, but written, I assure you, in a novel's form. You saw me stumble over the cadence of the words once earlier on, and besides the interruption of the emergency services, which I hope I remembered to delete, this is quite excellent, and it flowed from place to place with just the right feeling. There was a certain amount of mystery with the secretary that was eventually revealed and shown to be something even more wondrous and more mysterious. The plot for Fairyland is set up, and even though there isn't really a plot so much as a wandering, it certainly feels like there is something there meant for the main character that drives us on to the next chapter. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Check me out on Fiverr, as well as all the other things that I do that I will link down in the doobly-doo. You are all wonderful. Have a great evening.